my father and I are going to do a conversation called basically Monumental Stories. And it's just going to be a back and forth. We're going to have some slides come up, and we're just going to talk about what's up on the slide and talk about kind of the stories behind them, so you guys can get it. Because a lot of people have this notion, and unfortunately in my industry, it gets perpetuated, that you walk into a place and you're going to have somebody say, okay, you got 3 sizes and 3 colors and a couple of designs, and what do you want? Well, and this is where I get my soapbox. Those are tombstone dealers. I don't sell tombstones. I sell lasting visions of love. It took me a long time to be able to actually speak that once I created our mission statement. But I proudly now say, what do you do? I sell lasting visions of love. I do not. Do they normally manifest in a granite memorial or a bronze memorial? Yes, but we sell lasting visions of love, not tombstones. So to prove that, I'm going to first invite Eric Fogarty. Eric Fogarty has been in the memorial industry pretty much all his life. Eric is past president of the Xenia Rotary Club, member of the Xenia Chamber of Commerce. His company, who he co-owns with his wife Becky, has been recognized twice as the Dodds Monument Industrial Award winner of the Xenia Chamber of Commerce. He has been on Y boards, this boards, that boards, and lots of boards. And
you can also, go on all day if you wanted to.
Also, if you get him drinking, now, Eric Fogarty from Dodds Memorials, please welcome. So what we're going to do, we'll try to pull out of the way so we're not like right in front of, but we're going to pop some things up. The first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about where the heck modern memorials came from. For those of you that were at either of the cemetery events, you probably noticed there are certain, you want to pull those out? There are certain memorials that looked pretty darn good when you were touring, and there were certain memorials that didn't look so hot. So part of the reason that is because a lot of the older materials that memorials came from were, number one, either easy to access but also easy to pull out of the ground and use. So when you talk about limestone, marble, even you go out to Tombstone, Arizona, I bet Gail was probably familiar with some of this. In a dry arid place, they'd use pieces of wood, and they're still legible. So they would pull materials that were easy to use, easy to cut, carve, engrave, and start that. The problem is a lot of those materials weren't real hard. And so over the years, you start seeing the weathering and wasting away. So modern memorials, the granite memorials, come from the hot magma down in the earth below the crust. So what happens is you have activity, typically volcanic activity or just plate movement that pushes that stuff up closer and closer to the surface, typically in mountains, but not necessarily. And the way you can tell how long a granite was close to the surface or not, the smaller the granite typically means the faster it cools. So if you have real small grain granite, you're going to have a real fast cooling. Larger grain granite tends to cool more slowly because that's allowed it to crystallize. So you can, when you go in and you look at granite memorials, you can kind of see how long they cooled based on that. The other thing is, geologically speaking, there's very few things that are granite. We have a showroom full of stuff that's not granite. It's an igneous rock, it's still very hard, but if I walked up to you while you were trying to select a memorial and said, would you like a gabbro, a gneiss, a dole? For our purposes, it's all granite. It's all hard, it's going to last a long time. But very few things that we actually sell in the industry are, geologically speaking, the composition of quartz, feldspar, and mica that constitute a geological granite. Okay? But the good news about it is it's really hard stuff. And so I'm going to let Dad just kind of talk to you about some of these old pictures, and then we get to more modern stuff. I'll jump back in. So this is some of the old quarrying stuff that he knows about. And I'll show some of the more recent techniques.
Learning something or either remembering something I used to know and forgot. What we're doing here is we are starting out on the surface. As Neil said, granite is part of the Earth's mantle, was created typically by volcanic action. And what we deal with are the granites. There are granites that are very deep into the surface, under the surface, that we can't get to. They're there. Dayton is a good example of that. We're sitting on top of granite, but it's so far down, it's really not, either not usable or it's not accessible. But to the granite quarries, and there are some major granite quarries in the United States. This one is in Barre, Vermont. Barre, Vermont is one of the largest. Elberton, Georgia is another one. Multitude of smaller granite areas up in the northwest, or in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and places like that. But this is showing the granite quarry in Barre, Vermont. This could be the quarry, I can't see the whole thing, but the deepest active granite quarry in the world is in Barre, Vermont. And so what we do is you start at the top and you work down. The way that you work down is you make it cut it out in chunks. You usually cut around it. If you want to take a big block and you've got to take it out of the ground, you drill around it with big drills. What you see here are these very long drills that they're drilling, and all these little slots here are all from the big drills that they drill down around it. Then what they'll do, yeah, that's exactly what they're doing up there. They're making these long, you got the long bits, granite bits, and they're putting them right down into the ground. Then what they do is they will separate them, a couple different techniques in doing that, but we've got to get it off the bottom too. So they'll cut some holes in the bottom and then fill that with black powder, and they'll explode it, and it will lift it just enough to separate it from the floor of the quarry. Once they get these large blocks at the bottom cut out, whatever means they're using, then they've got these huge derricks. You always know when you're up in the Vermont area if you're getting close to a granite quarry, because there's many of them up there. You see these big things look like radio towers or so forth. That's the derrick that is used to lift these huge boulders. This boulder, if I had to guess, is probably 15 feet by 8 feet by 6 feet, probably weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 tons or something like that. So there's the picture I was looking for. That is the Rock of Ages quarry, and it's open to the public for tour. So if you're ever up in the Barre, Vermont area and you go to Rock of Ages, it's a very interesting tour. And again, you can see as they go down where they've taken blocks out and they keep moving back. They're going to take this block out next, then they'll take this block out, and it just keeps going all the way down to the bottom of the quarry. And that's exactly what an active quarry looks like.
And how long has that been there? Active?
Rock of Ages started in the late 1800s. So, and it's the deepest dimensional quarry in the world. Right now it's filled most with water. You're not going to be able to see the bottom of it, but it's 600 feet deep. The problem with what he just described is that quarrying technique has a lot of drawbacks. Number one, the deeper you go, you've got to somehow now pump the water out of there to keep being able to work. Number two, the deeper you go, the more pressure you create on the sidewalls of the quarry. And also, when you use black powder and drills to be able to break a loaf or a block away, it creates small fractures in the granite that a lot of times will render the granite useless. The best yields in granite, a lot of times, at least back in the day, if you got 10, 12, 14, 20% yield, that means that you had usable product in those percentages, and the rest became what they call grout, which is useless granite. And so what they've done is they've tried to update the techniques of granite quarrying to the more modern, what they call driving quarries. And with the driving quarry, you can actually see up top, it coming down, you are driving into the quarry instead of having a derrick drop people and machinery and pull things up, and you're doing the quarry work within that, driving the blocks back out of the quarry. They tend to be broader quarries because of that, but even the Smith quarry that he alluded to, that's 600 feet deep, they've converted into a driving quarry, and they're working off to the sides of it in order to make it a little easier, a little safer to work with. The other thing that they're doing now is they've got techniques where they no longer use drills and black powder. They've got these massive wire saws, and what they do with these wire saws is they actually, imagine this, they actually can figure out how to drill a hole this way, and somehow get them to meet to where they're going to run a wire through it, and then they start sawing that loaf until it's completely sawed through. And then to move that loaf off, once they get the bottom cut and the side cut, a lot of times they'll use either a large skid steer, for lack of better term, to pull it off, or they'll use airbags. And they'll just start inflating an airbag until eventually that loaf just goes, and then they turn it into blocks. By doing it this way, not using black powder, what you get is you get less fractures, fewer issues with the granite you're quarrying, and so the yields start going up. And it also is just a little bit safer because, again, you're not using explosives. So that's how, in the past 15, maybe 20 years, the quarrying side of the industry has changed, at least in the United States and in Canada. So now, by doing that, you can come with these kind of memorials instead of the old limestone and marble ones. Okay, so the first one, I'm going to take this one and we're going to kind of alternate. I had a gentleman in Beaver Creek that was very passionate about aviation. He worked in the defense industry, but always felt that this gentleman got short shrift when it came to the story of the Wright brothers. Mr. Falloy here was basically the first military test pilot in the United States when it came to working with the Wright brothers. He actually eventually became the head of the Air Corps, became a general, and became head of the Air Corps. And a lot of times in the story we hear about various people, but don't get to the point where we're talking about how the military started using the Wright planes, and he started test piloting. He actually went over to Europe during World War I. The American planes hadn't made it over yet. That didn't stop him. He decided to jump into a French airplane and help out. So there's a lot of different stories about Benjamin Falloy if you get a chance. But this is located over next to the Wright B. Flyer Memorial that's just on the Air Force Base. You can still access it through the gate. But that was a passion of a gentleman, and he was able to basically get Benjamin Falloy enshrined forever right next to the Wright B. Flyer. So that's the story of that memorial. It is done in a black granite and laser etched in order to do that. So that's story number one.
Story number two. The amazing thing is I sold or worked with a family and sold my first marker when I was 19 years old. And that was 52 years ago. And it's very interesting to see the changes that have evolved in design, especially. Design not only with what you put on the memorial, but also as far as shape with the new types of equipment that Neil alluded to. They have, that's at the quarry level, they have done the same thing over the years on the manufacturing level, where they take the block and then render it down to the memorials that you see in the cemetery. This was back many years ago. This is a Byron cemetery, and so one of the things that you'll see, and I'll just point out real quick, years ago the only way that you could really do any kind of personalization was using sandblast. Sandblast consists of a couple different things. You've got the polished surface, you've got the unpolished surface, and then you have the sandblasted lines to create the type of design that you want, give you contrast and give you definition. In this case, that's how this one was done. The wife came to the office and said he loved to go bowling. That was his passion. And so what we did is let's see what we can do in order to create that. But the thing is that was different back in my day, early days of personalization, was sandblasting was the only way we could do it. And because the lines had to be sandblasted, they had to be pretty thick, kind of like a magic marker line. So imagine making this design with a magic marker. Today it's going to be a lot different. Neil and I will address that here in a moment. But this was always sandblast, and so it's a very basic looking design, and we realize that, but this is what was available to us at the time. Now, Neil talked about, and I've talked about granite being very hard. It is most of the time, but once in a while you find one of those where even a bowling ball can be shoved through, because on the front of the monument he's bowling, but on the back of the monument the ball went through and he got his strike. So that was, and again, again, this right here is using where we have polish, knock off the polish to make a contrast, but there's no sandblasted lines. We just kept polish in there. And again, I think that'll be kind of keep that in mind as we go through to the more modern types of designs that we're doing today.
Okay, so next story. This is Mary Sheeler. Mary, as you can tell, had Down syndrome. Wonderful young lady, was in her teens. She was biking home and was tragically struck and killed by a driver. Not drunk, just didn't see her. It was just a real tragic thing. And so her parents tried to find meaning out of that. And they did in a couple different ways, but one of the things they found out, they lived down in the Mason area. Mason was creating this modern park, and within this park, they tried to make the entire park accessible to all children. Children with special needs, even the folks that bring children along. So if you had parents or grandparents that didn't have the best health, it was a way to where you had an environment for all of those folks to be able to enjoy the park, enjoy the playground and what have you. Well, what they wanted to do is make a centerpiece that welcomed people into this park. So we were commissioned to do a bronze statue and started with clay modeling for the family. And let me tell you something, when you're trying to clay model a likeness of a person's child who's been tragically killed, that's a tough process. There was a moment in time I didn't know if we were going to get there because Ellie Sheeler, her mother, was very emphatic about what she wanted. And there were conversations I had with the bronze specialist, the gentleman that cast in Yonkers, New York, that we were both like, I don't know if we can do what she wants. Because obviously a grieving mother has a certain vision in her mind of what her daughter looks like. And so we worked and worked and worked for 2 years, but finally we're able to get approval, and now Mary is standing at the front of this accessible area holding a butterfly and a stuffed animal and welcoming everybody into the park to utilize it. So a young lady with special needs tragically killed is now eternally going to be able to be there and be this welcoming person for everybody that visits the park. So that's Mary's story.
Where are we headed next?
Where are we headed next?
Crotty. We've all heard the name Crotty, the old Crotty Uniform Company. This is at Calvary Cemetery. And I remember when I first started working with Mr. Crotty, he wanted to do something a little different. He wanted to do something unique. We started out going towards a mausoleum and columbarium type thing. He decided he didn't want to do that. So he said, I want you to design something, I want statuary, I want something statuary, I want something a little different. And so I walked in his office and we were talking, and he said, what can we do that will make this different? I said, who's your favorite, you want a statue and you want it, it's in Calvary Cemetery. He said, who is your favorite saint? What inspired you? And he said, St. Francis. And he said, that's what I want. And he said, but where can I go from there? And I said, well, you've been very successful in your life. You have, and I'm standing in his office talking to him, he's sitting on one of his chairs, and I said, you've always been very strong in your life. From what I've heard of your family, you're a strong patriarch of the family, you've been very successful in the business. I said, one of the things that I would envision that would represent you well would be a lion. That just seemed to fit his personality. Very nice guy. He said, looked at me kind of strangely, he said, turn around. I turned around and there was a picture, it was probably 4 foot by 6 foot, of a lion and its family. And so it developed from there the thought process from the Bible, the lion laying down next to the lamb, St. Francis having the holding the bird and that. So this became a very popular, it was a water feature at that time because we felt that would keep it more flowing. And so it's obviously still there, but that's at Calvary Cemetery, and that's how this developed.
Okay, this is not anything about the memorial itself. Actually, the gentleman that sold these has joined us today, Rick Meyer. worked with John Cravens to create these. And that part of the story was pretty straightforward. John Cravens beat us up and down for price and color. I mean, he was a negotiator. But what we wanted to do is he and I flew to Cold Spring, John Cravens and I, because he wanted to pick out which one of his slabs went to which part of his mausoleum, because this granite has some features, some seams, some variegation that can be unsightly. So we fly up to Minnesota, everything went great, we pick out slabs, have a nice time, and we're driving back from Cold Spring, Minnesota to the airport in Minneapolis to fly out. And you have to understand, John Cravens is a huge Buckeyes fan. I mean, insane. He's got like Bucks 17-0 from their first national championship in '02, well, most recent, besides 14, and he just lives, he used to go to every single game. He had an RV, he traveled every game. I mean, he was Mr. Buckeye, right? So we're driving back and he goes, you know what? I really like the idea of the possibility of putting big block O's on the back of my mausoleum. Now, of course, I'm a Buckeyes fan, but I'm picturing these beautiful mausoleums with huge white block O's on the back, and I'm thinking to myself, how do I talk him out of this? Because John was not an easy guy to talk out of much of anything. So my head just spinning, right? What am I doing? What am I doing? So a few minutes later, I remembered that we had done a bench off the side of a monument that had the Chicago Bears like football field on it. I said, John, what if we put a bench with the Ohio State football field on the top of it? He's like, oh man, that'd be cool. And he started talking, maybe we can do like a U-shaped sidewalk we put in the middle. And so now all of a sudden we're going, right? Two fans just juicing up, and I'm like, what if we made block goes out of the legs? Oh man, that sounds great. And what if we inlaid it, instead of just sandblasting it, what if we inlaid it with colors of granite that look just like. So by the time we got to the airport, I'd salvaged the two mausoleums from being eternally, had 6-foot block O's on them, and we ended up in having this instead, right out in front of the two mausoleums. Couldn't be happier, and I think the biggest takeaway point of this is if you're selling a memorial, if you're not talking to the family, getting to know them, getting to understand them, walking through things with them, then you're going to miss out and do a disservice to them and not offer them the opportunity. You could have said, you're nuts, there's no way I'm going to do that. But we were able to come up with that. And unfortunately, I've replaced that thing twice because the granite keeps cracking, but that's besides the point. But yeah, so it was a really neat thing and something we ended up doing.
Let me digress a little bit. On the karate, the name of the company was Van Dyne Karate. That might make it a little bit more familiar, the company, uniform company. One of the things we talked about, or that I talked about earlier, was the fact how we have evolved in being able to pick the family's brains and then take that, because what we want to do, our object and our goal, let's put it that way, our goal as memorialists, and I speak for everybody who's been in the business, is to sit down with the family, get to know them, and get a feel for their passions, as Neil just talked about in great detail. But sometimes it's a little thing that turns into something that you don't expect. Now that we can do different things with shape in the manufacturing process, this gentleman came into the office. This is a Byron Cemetery where we have a lot of illustrations. He wanted us to do a couple things. He had a family of 3 kids, and he wanted to represent his family. So what we did up here is put the mother and the father represented by the large birds and the 3 smaller birds, one kind of being in bed. But his wife must have been, I didn't know her, but he would tell stories, and she must have been a real character, because she developed her own business card that she created a symbol for that represented herself. She loved to party. She loved to dance. She loved to have parties. Their house was a party central over in Fairborn. She actually created this, come to our party, and she put the date on it, and it would have her sitting there with a glass of bubbly and on a swing, because she loved to have this swing in the backyard. He said, I want somehow to create a tree and and then have her on her swing. And so we talked about drawing and so forth, and we've done trees by sandblasting, like we kind of do, or I did with the bowler, where you just kind of draw it on. He said, no, he said, oh, I need more than that. So what we ended up doing is taking, he loved to hunt, but sculpting this entire front of this. That tree is raised about, half, 3/4 of an inch, all the way off the face, then they had to go back and then hand polish. But this was, and then we created a curved front, so during the summer he can do plantings down here under the tree. And so this was a good illustration of something very personal that had a kind of a cute story behind it. We are fortunate as memorialists in the fact that people talk about, how can you do this? Well, it's got to be really tough. Well, what's really tough is being the funeral director who has to deal with them within the immediacy after a death. The next thing is working with the cemeterians, because they're also working with them at that first, within hours of the death. We have the luxury, if we want to call it that, the opportunity that the family, it's usually average of maybe 30 to 90 days. By the time we talk to the family, they've had time to catch their breath, regroup, think about things. And so I tell people it's a pleasure and it's enjoyable being a memorialist, because we're there at a time when they are thinking about how can I do something for that person that we've lost, and we're working at it a little bit better. And so there's a lot of laughter, a lot of stories being told, because those are things we need to find out. What are the stories that you're trying to tell? How can we incorporate that, if possible, into the memorial?
Well, one last piece of this, if you look at the vases, they look like cut logs.
Yeah.
So there's just one more piece on that one. Okay, this one is nothing incredibly unique other than the fact that the mother and the 3 daughters of Thomas, so Carolyn and her 3 daughters, came to me to talk about this, and they had no idea what they had an idea they wanted something old and unique and something kind of a neoclassical throwback kind of thing. And so sometimes you can't figure out ideas just sitting with the family. So we set up a time, we actually went to Woodland Cemetery in Xenia, and the 5 of us literally walked in circles around the cemetery, and they would say, ooh, I like that, and I'd take a picture. Ooh, I like that. And by doing that, by taking the time and going into the old sections of Woodland, we were able to come up with the elements of, a not completely finished memorial coming out of rock. That was very popular back in the day. Some columns that had the ivy on them. They liked these raised curved style of panels coming right out of the rock. And these features were never on any single memorial, but by looking 5, 6, 7 different memorials, we were able to piece together what they wanted and end up creating this. It is up in Riverside West Milton Cemetery. And so, again, not spectacularly detailed as far as personalization like some of the others we've shown, but it shows a path that when you spend time with people, you can get them to where they want to go.
Another, as you might be able to guess, if I asked you what kind of a cemetery would this be at, that is a Calvary cemetery. Had a family come in many years ago, and when my wife Becky and I bought the company back in 1984, Dodds Monumental was established in 1864. It's one of the oldest continuing businesses of its kind, certainly in Southwest Ohio in the state, but probably even in the country. But there were some things that kind of came with the company that just were there. One of them was about a 12-foot tall. We have a very large showroom in Xenia. The home office is in downtown Xenia, a very old building. Parts of it came from the 1903 World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. But one of the things was this tall pillar that I didn't know what we were ever going to do with. I didn't even know how we were going to move it. Lady came in, and this is the daughter that I dealt with, and she came in and wanted to design something for her parents, and she wanted a statue, and we just talked and talked, and she said, I wanted to sit up on a pedestal, but I wanted something a little bit different looking. And she kind of looked at that pillar and said, maybe something kind of like that. And that's, the idea struck me. What we did is we took that pillar, used it for the base of the statue. Then again, like on another one, we took what was cut off of it, had that cored out, and actually became the bases on the side. So this is using a pillar or a column that have no idea. I know what color it is, but have no idea what it was, why it was there. It was probably something that was part of one of the huge. Dodds years ago owned 3 quarries in northeast United States, up in the New England area, and so they had a lot of opportunities to have a lot of odds and ends around. But this is one of those things where you take a piece, and if the family gives you ideas, and end up using something that you never ever thought you'd use.
That is the one beautiful thing of the stuff laying around our building. There's not really a shelf life. So you'd be amazed at some of the old stuff we pulled out and used for people over the years. So the main reason I want to show this one is just obviously it is a cool thing, and I mean no disrespect to Parker or to the family, but Woody spent a lot of time in our building in Xenia while we were trying to get it figured out. His hat comes off, so if you can imagine, this hat's ginormous. Somebody jokingly said, I'm going to put that on, try to pick it up, there's no chance. But when Woody was in our building, it was a pretty dark building, not a lot of lighting. I didn't particularly care for Woody being in our building while he was there, because the dude freaked me out. I'm telling you. I mean, you hear about the oil paintings that follow you, right? You walk by Woody, he would follow, his eyes would follow you. I mean, he's beautiful outside with the hat on. He looks exactly what he's supposed to be. He obviously was Parker's favorite character, but if you imagine Woody in a dark building, I was so glad to see him finally make it out to the cemetery, because he freaked me out. So that's one of the reasons, again, personalization, the boot, Woody, the hat, getting the hat up there was a feat in and of itself. But obviously taking the story of this child's favorite character who unfortunately tragically passed way too young and making it something that people can go there, and this is what it's about, telling stories, right? You walk up to Parker's grave, you know a lot about Parker just by walking up to his grave. And that's what we want. You can do it in fancy ways, you can do it in simple ways. We want to tell a story in one way, shape, or form, tell a story. Another one here, just quickly, this is a neat memorial. This gentleman is why he pretty much designed this memorial, helped design it for us with a lot of concepts, but he was an Air Force One pilot. And she actually wrote a book about him being an Air Force One pilot, and this is clear in West Liberty, Ohio, but through conversations with her, we were able to use multiple granites, obviously etch the plane actually on the memorial. He obviously did more things than just pilot Air Force One throughout his career in the Air Force, but just a pretty amazing thing. And when you go up to that cemetery, because it's an older rural cemetery, this thing really stands out, and it's really interesting.
Let me jump in here, because this is a perfect example of what I was going to say before. Before, again, all of our design capabilities were based on sandblasting, and I didn't tell you, I don't get any technical, but you'd sandblast through a stencil, and it has to be so thick. Now, when they started going more internationally with granites, we were able to get granites from India, from China, that were coal black, and technically, as Neil was saying before, they're not technically granites, but for our purpose, they do serve that purpose. And because of their fine-grained black, we were able to do things we could never do before, and one of the things we really do a lot now is lasering. If you'll look at the detail in the bald eagle, in the planes, in the cloud work there, you never could have done something like that using a magic marker. All right, so what we've done now is we use lasers, and we will lay that out. It'll be laid out in the computer, and what it does is it's been several years since I've been active, so if you guys want to correct me, but it actually will make a dot. The laser hits the granite, and it explodes the granite about a diameter of a dot, about a diameter of 1/200th of an inch. So every inch you can make 200 dots, and by making them close together, you can create lighter spots. By spreading those dots out, you can create gray tones and so forth, or you can leave it polished. And so we now, instead of just making like a drawing with magic marker, we're now able to make photographic quality renderings of portraits, of checks, of anything that might have been interest to the family. And so what we've done here is taken this beautiful blue Swedish granite, inlaid it, I'm assuming here because I wasn't involved with it, so using 3 or 4 different colors, but the lasering is probably the most interesting and unique innovation in design that I've seen in my lifetime, because we can now do things before were just unimaginable. And because we've exploded that granite and destroyed the polish where the laser has hit, the polish cannot regenerate itself. So it will be there as long as there is the polish to support that, because polish eventually, in a couple, maybe another 500, 600, 700 years, 1,000 years, whatever it is, will start to fade a little bit on some of the darker granites. But this is, for all intents and purposes, a beautiful way to permanently personalize memorials.
Hey Neil,
Yeah.
they were born on the same day?
According to this, sure looks like
Very
it.
observant.
It was either that, or when we were doing the initial design rendering, we didn't update one of
I'll say
their
that's
dates, and that's possible.
That's pretty cool.
All right, so that just gives you a flavor of what we do and how interesting it is. I'll end up with one last story, because this one is a really comical one. And I luckily actually don't have a picture of this, but we had a gentleman come in with his wife, and he wanted his convertible, and this is back in the time we hand etched. He wanted his convertible placed on the memorial. Okay, no problem. But what he also wanted in the back seat of the convertible was a topless woman with his wife sitting right there. And he didn't want his wife as the topless woman in his convertible. And so literally we had to go through this process of this guy going through these calendars of Hawaiian women. He's like, I want that one. And we kept trying to talk him out of it, right? You don't want to do this, you don't want to do that. I don't know how she was feeling through the process. Finally, one of the last approvals, we sat down with him and said, really, do you want this out in the cemetery for all eternity? Number one, not being your wife, and number two, being topless. So we finally got him convinced. He didn't take her away, but we put a bikini top on her. So she's still there, but thank the Lord, we at least clothed the woman. And so for eternity, we've got a guy, his wife, and some random Hawaiian woman in a convertible in the back seat on his mark. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening. Appreciate the time. If you have any questions of any of us, we are now basically available for lunch. We've got a buffet in the back. It's basically a cold cut buffet, so we invite you to take a break, take some time, grab some food. If you need updates from the Buckeyes game, just let me know. I can shout those out. And then after lunch, we'll jump back in and do the afternoon session, which will be more based on funeral planning, hospice, and cremation, what it is and what it is not. So thank you for your attentiveness so far. Please, go eat.